compromise. So tonight we'll ask what's really on the table in terms of a peace deal for Ukraine. What does Europe's solidarity mean in practice? How does the drive to rearm Europe fit into the politics of the moment? And what would durable peace in Ukraine actually require? I'm thrilled to say that we're welcoming back to the show Volodymyr Ishchenko, the Ukrainian sociologist, the author of Ukraine from Maidan to War. He's based in Germany and he's with us now. And of course, we have our own Yanis Varoufakis, and of course we've got you out there watching us on YouTube. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, anything you want to throw at us, please put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. And before we kick off, I just want to say, in order to have a more perhaps substantive and more nuanced discussion, we can oppose Russian aggression, as I think everyone here has done in this panel, and still debate the policy choices of the West. So please keep that in mind when you're listening to what our panelists are going to be saying. So, Volodymyr, let's kick it off with you. Can you tell us where are we at now in terms of a peace deal, and how is all this being received inside Ukraine, to the extent that you can share it with us?
Well, starting from my assessment about the ongoing negotiations, so they look like the most serious attempt to find a negotiated solution to the war. So far as we could judge, based on the 28 points plan, that basically the only plan except of what Europe proposed that have been publicized, and it's obviously going to be changed, negotiated, renegotiated. We do not even know what exactly Witkoff and Putin discussed yesterday so far. So obviously the final document might be quite different from what we've been presented in public. But if judging these 28 points, two things that I think are important to notice. It does fixate Ukraine's defeat, and that's important to understand, because in at least some form, it includes basically everything that Putin demanded, at least publicly. So some form of demilitarization, some form of so-called denazification, some form of, Ukraine's neutrality and no NATO in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So basically, Putin has been pretty consistent in what he demanded from Ukraine since 2022, also not necessarily specific. And now we are getting to the plan, which in a certain form starts to specify those demands. And a very difficult question about territory and ceding the part of Donbass, which Russia has not yet even occupied. But at the same time, I also think that what is presented is not a capitulation of Ukraine. So just to notice how far what is being discussed, just thinking about 600,000 of Ukrainian army, which is kind of like a way to meet the demand of so-called demilitarization. At the same time, it's the army that would be twice as big as Ukraine had before the start of the invasion. And the pretty common question is and who is going to pay for an army of such size, which would be something like just half of all other European armies combined at this moment. So it's pretty far from, for example, taking control over most of Ukrainian territory, taking the capital, imposing anything like a puppet government in Kiev, eliminating Ukrainian identity, and so on and so forth, has been pretty kind of prominent in a certain narrative about the war. This is going to be a Ukrainian state run by Ukrainian government, taking certain compromises and accepting certain demands from Russia, which may be pretty kind of like painful, but at the same time, it's pretty far from destroying Ukraine. And that's also may also raise a question what exactly Russia wanted if they are ready to accept something pretty far from what is described as maximalist demands, while they objectively have an upper hand on the front line and may continue with the offensive operation at an accelerating speed and threaten to destroy Ukrainian energy system even more, causing like potentially catastrophic humanitarian outcomes. And in terms of what the Ukrainian population think about this plan, well, as a sociologist, I would really prefer to base this judgment on kind of representative data, but I haven't seen any poll that I would trust by this moment that would just simply ask the Ukrainians what they think about this plan and whether they would be ready to accept it or not. And I would hypothesize that quite a lot of people would be actually having some hopes that at least the start of negotiations would lead to some eventual deal that might end the war. The fatigue in Ukraine is pretty visible. And whatever even people say in public or in the polls, there are pretty clear behavioral indicators that not so many people are ready to fight at this moment, with the level of, well, actually record high level of desertion, of AWOLs, absent without leave, of the people who dodged the draft. That does not provide the reliable base to continue the war. And well, at the same time, Russia is capable to recruit 30,000 of mostly volunteers, not all of them are volunteers, but mostly volunteers, offering them high payment every month and sustain an army of that can proceed with accelerating speed, taking Ukrainian territory and causing Ukrainian army even more casualties, and also obviously dropping the motivation to fight even more. And not speaking about the urbicide that they are doing in Ukraine, destroying the energy system and other infrastructure. So this is my assessment of the plan and what I think is currently happening with the most of Ukrainians.
Thank you, Volodymyr. To your point on data, I mean, it's data that's few months old now, but according to polls like Gallup and so on, most Ukrainians now favor negotiations to stop the fighting, but they want it tied to strong security guarantees, and they still reject anything that looks like an imposed surrender. So that's the data that I'm looking at the moment. Yanis, what do you think that the US is trying to achieve with this, and what is Europe trying to do in response?
Well, what Trump wants is very clear. He wants to close down the war in Ukraine. He doesn't care how it's closed down. He belongs to the school of thought in the United States, the so-called realist school of thought, according to which there was no point in the United States fighting two wars, one against Russia and one against China. He considered to be his team. I'm not talking about Donald Trump personally. He considered it idiotic to effectively push Russia into the arms of China after decades of American foreign policy being all about splitting Russia from China. He wants to concentrate on China, and he wants to disengage from Europe. For him, NATO is surplus to requirements. The European Union is an enemy. He has very clearly stated it. So I'm not condoning what I'm doing. I'm describing it, and he has a point in seeing that the Europeans have absolutely no strategy. The Europeans will go down in history as people who have. I'm talking about the politicians now, the bureaucrats, they led Ukraine down the garden path, and it is heart-wrenching. They wrapped themselves in the Ukrainian flag and betrayed Ukraine so deeply by not having a strategy. They have no strategy for peace. There's no peace process in their mind at all, and they have no strategy for war. They talk a good game, but they're not prepared to pay for the Ukrainians. If you look at what they're doing now, the great debate in Brussels now is the frozen assets of the Russian central bank, about 140, 150 billion, and the loan that is going to be to begin with. They, instead of saying, okay, we want to fund another 2 years, for another 2 years, the Ukrainian war machine, because we want the war to continue. I'm not judging it. I'm saying if this is what they want, if they want the war to continue, which is clear that they do because they're trying to do their utmost in order to make sure that there's no peace deal. They've been doing it since April 2022. They've been telling Zelensky, you must not cease. They were even against a ceasefire until Trump forced them to agree to the idea of a ceasefire. So what they're doing now with these frozen Russian assets is just quite astonishing. They're talking about a reparation loan. That is, they don't want to pay for Ukraine, so they are going to borrow money from the international bond markets, and they will use the Russian money as collateral. But if they do that, it will, with 100% probability, lead to those Russian assets being confiscated. But if they are confiscated, then of course this is going to be a red flag for Putin. So you do that, you can only confiscate somebody's money if you want to continue the war with them. You cannot do this in the context of a peace process, because there's no way you can impose reparations on an enemy unless you defeat them at the battlefield. And they're not prepared to do that. And they're not prepared to have a peace process. And what peace process there is between the United States and Russia, they are jeopardizing, they are undermining, they are trying to delay it, they are trying to obstruct it. So Europe is a culprit here. Europe's position, lack of strategic thinking, has given Trump an alibi for essentially steamrolling over Ukraine and pushing any deal that ends the conflict on, to a very large extent, Putin's terms. But we also have to take into consideration the fact that on the ground, I don't know what you think, Volodymyr, but my understanding is that with every day that passes, more territory of the Ukrainian state is being taken over by the slow grinding Russian war machine. So I don't know. I'm very upset with the Europeans because they don't give a damn about Ukraine. As I said, it's hypocrisy at a level that, of course, it reminds me of the way that they treated Greece. It's hypocrisy because, in the end, all they want is they want to justify transferring Volkswagen production lines onto Rheinmetall to produce tanks that Ukraine doesn't really need or want. None of us want. But they want to prevent the pace of deindustrialization of Germany and of the heartlands, the industrial heartlands of Europe. And for them, military Keynesianism is the only game that they are left with after the Green Deal has died. And they don't want the war in Ukraine to end. It's really very simple. And so without a plan for peace, without a plan for war, they are simply delaying whatever peace process there is without having a single idea about what kind of peace process they would like. They could have gone to Putin, for instance, with their own peace process and say, look, you want your frozen assets back from Euroclear, from Belgium? Here is the deal. What is the deal? I keep asking European functionaries, what is a kind of peace agreement that you would go with? And they keep talking nonsense. They're talking about Crimea being taken back and Putin being forced to pay for his war crimes. Well, if that's what you want, mates, send troops to fight and defeat Putin in the battlefields. If you think, I don't think that, but if you think that Putin is a new Hitler, send your arms in. This is what we did when there was the original Hitler in. But they don't do that. They are not suing for peace. They have no strategic planning. They are not prepared to pay for the Ukrainian war effort. They are not prepared to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So they would like to be able to press a button and to keep everything as is, which is utterly detrimental to the interests of Ukraine, and at the same time, and that's what I would like to hear Volodymyr talk about, is what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, what's happening within Ukrainian society, about the class war within Ukraine. How is the ruling class within Ukraine utilizing this war in order to make gains against the working class? These are all the things that the European position is putting in abeyance and actually allowing to deteriorate against the interests of the majority of Ukrainians on a daily basis.
Thank you, Yanis. And Volodymyr, I would like to get your reaction. But before I do, Yanis, you kind of articulated it there, but I'd like you to sort of tackle head on this argument that I keep hearing, this more values first argument that, look, Putin has already acted very aggressively against Ukraine. We need to support this country to the max. We need to beat him back. That we're fighting in there. The Ukrainians are fighting him there because otherwise he'll be at our doorstep, etc. Can you, in just a couple of sentences, tackle that argument head on?
Well, there's no doubt that Putin is the aggressor here. He invaded a country. There's also no doubt that he was provoked. And you know what? I'm perfectly capable. I don't know what's going on in the mind of the so-called supporters of Ukraine who say, but if you say that he was provoked, you're effectively taking his side. No. Mehran, if you provoke me, if you say something nasty about me or even slap me across the face and I take out the machine gun and kill you, I'm not justified to do it just because you provoked me. The NATO expansion was provocatory. Is that a justification for an invasion of Ukraine? Absolutely no. And DiEM25 supports every country and every community that is being invaded by an aggressor. So on this, there's no doubt. But the question is, how are we going to support Ukraine? That was always the question. And you don't do this by saying to the Ukrainians, keep killing yourselves or getting killed while we're staying out of it. And we are going to boycott any peace plan that will end the killing, and we're not going to help you win the war. I mean, that to me is a dereliction of duty and essentially the denigration of so-called European values. Are these our values? Hypocrisy?
Thank you very much for that, Yanis. Volodymyr, your reaction, please.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced with the argument about provocation, unless we take the provocation in a very broad sense. Right, so I do think that NATO expansion was actually very important as a cause of the war, but not necessarily that we need to take at face value what Putin says about the real causal mechanism behind NATO expansion and the war. But that's a big discussion, and I've been writing a lot about how the war could rise from the post-Soviet class conflict. But what I've wanted to say is actually to continue this discussion about what Europe is doing right now. And that's actually a question that I'm thinking. Why Europe didn't even have any kind of serious peace plan before Witkov and Dmitriev let out their kind of like draft of what they were working on. But Europe produced something that would be just dismissed immediately by Russia and without any connection to the reality. And here, well, that's probably, I think Yanis could comment much more about the interests and agendas that the European elite have. But I'm just thinking first about the... So in a certain sense, some people might believe that they buy the time for Europe to rearm, and they buy the time with your Ukrainian lives. And I think they pretty well understand what they're doing now. But they might say that, well, we need some time, some more years to to have more weapons, to build stronger European armies, and so on and so forth, and be prepared against invasion, for example, in Baltic states. Which I don't think it's entirely something that we should dismiss. I actually think that under certain scenarios it might be possible. But nevertheless, we also understand the dynamics, what they're doing with Ukraine right now. But also, it's not just that. I think it might also be a kind of like a blame game. So Europe kind of like stands in white clothes with Ukraine, or, well, what they present as standing with Ukraine in a very, very kind of like pathetic and indeed hypocritical way. But also it's obviously some kind of a crisis of leadership, why they were never capable to take a lead in the process that might lead to any realistic solution to the war. And even before that, Europe did not make serious attempts to build a really inclusive security structure that might involve both EU, Ukraine, and Russia, even before the start of the war. Because, well, the question of NATO expansion, in my opinion, has never been primarily about inclusion of Ukraine, but rather it was primarily about Russia exclusion from that process. And finally, it's apparently some kind of like crisis of knowledge, both about Ukraine and Russia, just to understand that how detached the decision makers and probably their consultants are from the realities in Ukraine and Russia, and with their beliefs that the war as it is going on right now may eventually lead to much better negotiating positions for Ukraine, as the arguments that have been made by Europeans quite a lot of time, and just simply been debunked by the very different reality that just says about the very little knowledge about what's really going on in both countries, and maybe in Europe itself. And
Sorry to cut
also
you off
thinking
there.
about the social political consequences of the continuing policies with the escalating crisis of the centrist elites in the major European countries, in Germany, in France, and Great Britain, and the rising, well, typically far-right parties that criticize these policies and different authoritarian tendencies, and just how well they even understand where the consequences of their policies would be.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Go on.
If
Yeah,
I may
sorry.
jump in, look, Volodymyr, the problem with the European Union is that it's very good with pronouncements, with grand narratives, and with large numbers that cannot withstand any scrutiny, that disappear, evaporate in the cold light of day. And this is not just with Ukraine. For 20, 30 years now, at least since the creation of the euro, whenever there's been a crisis, they've got together, they've made these pronouncements, they had their press conferences, their press releases, and they celebrated wonderful solutions to whatever problem that they were tackling, whether it was the euro crisis, the crisis of underinvestment, then the climate catastrophe with the Green Deal. The Green Deal is a perfect example. Ursula von der Leyen was elected or appointed in 2019 to be the president of the European Commission the first time. And she came out with this Green Deal and she promised Europeans 1,000 billion euros for the green transition. 1 trillion, 1,000 billion. Now, 5 years later, after her first term expired, only 27 of these 1,000 billions were being spent on the green transition. So in other words, it wasn't there. The money wasn't there. And they were not prepared to do anything about it, about raising the money. It was all, as I said, smoke and mirrors. Similarly, they know that if the war, as I hope it does, ends tomorrow morning, they will have to fork out at least 500 billion. My estimation is 1,000 billion, similar number to the one that was promised in the green transition back in 2019, for rebuilding Ukraine. And not only rebuilding Ukraine, but taking care of all the spillover costs, because Ukraine, I think, needs and deserves to be part of the common agricultural policy. The farmlands of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union and of much of Europe today and the world, needs to be developed. And this is what the United States will impose upon the Europeans anyway. This is what the United States do every time there's a war, whether it's in the Gulf or whether it's in Europe. They make other people pay for it, and they know that. The European leaders know that, and they're bankrupt. As we speak, they cannot make ends meet. Today, the European budget is bunk, and they have no way of even knowing how to begin discussing where to find the 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 billion that they will need to rebuild Ukraine, to reintegrate Ukraine in the rest of Europe. I hope that Ukraine is integrated in Europe as a neutral country in the way that Austria was during the Cold War. But that's not neither here nor there. The important thing is that the Europeans have not even managed to plan the manner in which they will debate amongst themselves where to find the money. This whole kerfuffle about the Russian assets is a distraction. They use that as distraction in order not to have this discussion, whether it's a question of funding the war effort while the war is continuing, or funding the rebuilding of a post-war Ukraine. And therefore, they do what they know best, which is to delay. I have no doubt that they will do their utmost to make sure that this peace deal, independently of how good it is or bad it is for Ukraine, will not go through, because they're panicking as we speak. Yeah, they just don't have the money to do that which will be expected of them by their population, by their parliaments, on behalf of Ukraine, if there is a peace.
Yanis, let me ask you, what do you think of the argument made by your colleague at Unheard, Wolfgang Munchau, and also I think Volodymyr mentioned it as well, that Europe's real goal here is extremely cynical. It's trying to buy some time by keeping Putin busy in Ukraine without committing troops to Ukraine, their own troops to Ukraine, European troops, in the hope that it can rearm so that, to go through with this Readiness 2030 package. How do you rate that as an argument?
I think many politicians in Brussels and in Berlin believe that. I think it's rubbish, personally. And I think it's rubbish for two reasons. Firstly, they're not going to rearm. They are talking big numbers. The procurement that they are going to stage is phony. They will buy a few more weapons from Donald Trump. They will buy and build a few more Leopard tanks in Rheinmetall's factories that have been taken over from Volkswagen. This is not going to increase significantly the military capacities of the European Union. The European Union is not going to become militarily significantly more powerful as a result of all this. And in the end, if you really worry about Putin and Putin's capacity to mobilize his economy, his war economy, against Europe, the continuation of this war, which is what the Europeans are actually working towards by obstructing peace, and they've been doing so, as I said, since April 2022. If you really want to help Putin, you continue with this war, because the war economy in Russia is actually working. It is a monstrosity, but it is working. It is diverting resources from where they should go to where they shouldn't go, towards, in the same way that Hitler's military Keynesianism was working. It is working in Russia. So, our comrades in Russia Democrats and socialists are suffering. I have friends who are in prison now, and they tell me that Putin is getting stronger with every day that this war is continuing. And the Europeans, by prolonging this war, because they don't want to pay, they don't even want to have a discussion of whether will they find the money to incorporate Ukraine within the marketplaces of the European Union. They're doing their utmost, unbeknownst to them, of course. I'm not saying they're doing this on purpose. It's out of sheer stupidity. It's not by design. They are helping Putin get stronger and become a threat to Europe. Because you see, at the moment, I don't think militarily he is a threat to Europe. You know, it took him a year to get Pokrovsk. Thousands and thousands died to win over a destroyed territory of a few kilometers. There's no real danger at the moment from a Russian military incursion into Europe. None. But there will be. If the Europeans continue this way, and they will keep boosting the war machine and the war economy of Putin, maybe in a couple of years or 5 years, maybe he will have the capacity to realize their worst enemy, the worst nightmares, or not enemies, the worst nightmares, I should say.
Thanks, Yanis. Volodymyr, I want to bring you back in, but let me just read out a couple of comments from the chat. Simon Hodges says the West always saw Ukraine as expendable. They were just a pawn, a sacrifice in the greater Russian regime change game. Mark Bulmer says, quote, we stand with Ukraine, unquote, as long as they're buying our weapons and staying over there. Cam Colito says Europe cannot betray Ukraine. It is not even in Europe and we aren't allied. And BDS Boycott says it was always about natural resources and, quote, fighting until the very last Ukrainian, unquote. To think otherwise means you're either phony or part of the corruption. There are also a lot of comments here about Ukraine, corruption inside Ukraine, Nazism, and so on. And Volodymyr, I'd like your comment, of course, on what Yanis just said, but also if you can give us a picture of what is it that Western audiences get wrong about unity inside Ukraine right now.
Just we had a couple of comments on what Yanis said, and I think I actually found Yanis' criticism of potential military tensionism in Europe, the talk you made quite recently, and I watched the talk, pretty convincing. And military tensionism, even in Russia, it does produce contradictory effects. There are those who wins from the policy and those who lose, and those who lose are not very happy about very accelerating inflation that became a big problem for Russian central bank. Well, it's also kind of like moving the resources to the military sphere from the civilian spheres, where they might be more necessary, in particular in the public health or in education. So it's so far as I know, this debate on military tensionism, this is a debate to which extent it can be sustainable in the long term. But it did produce very important positive effects for Russia, at least in the short run, which did provide Putin the capacity to continue the war at the intensified extent and accelerating speed, taking more Ukrainian territory and so on, and while consolidating the regime within Russia. But an important condition for that was actually the vast legacy of the Soviet military-industrial complex. The Soviet Union was preparing to fight the war with NATO for half a century. And this is not something that was that's present in the Western Europe, not speaking about the Eastern European countries, where the core of the NATO military-industrial complex was primarily in the United States, and that's why we are having this discussion about the buying of the American weapons, because Europe not necessarily may produce it. And so just thinking about those potential positive effects that European military keynesianism might have, well, just there are no conditions for that.
Volodymyr,
And
if I may, sorry to cut you off, because Yanis has he just told us he has to leave, unfortunately, in a couple of minutes. So given that we're going to be staying on a little bit longer for you, if I can ask you just to hold your point, and I'll get Yanis to respond to what you've already said, and maybe to wrap up the things that he said, because we have to unfortunately say goodbye to him early today. Yanis.
yeah, absolutely.
Sorry about that, Volodymyr. It was just a last minute thing that just happened. Yanis, go for it.
Well, before I say anything else, let me say, Volodymyr, we haven't met. It's a great honor and privilege to be meeting you here. I follow your work. I learn a lot of it, and I have a lot more to learn from you because, this war has thrown a blanket of silence and opacity over what's really happening within Ukrainian society. This polarization has prevented us from understanding, getting a feel of the true clashes and the true conflicts within Ukrainian society. But let me say quickly that, yeah, I thought that I articulate that point, but you made it very well, saying that the war economy, like any war economy, like any kind of military Keynesianism, is a class war as well. And it creates circumstances by which, yes, there are jobs that are being created, and there are communities that benefit from producing ammunitions and so on. But in the medium to long term, first you have a massive reduction in the actual welfare of the working classes, the middle classes. You have too much power and too much wealth being concentrated in too few hands. You have the strengthening of the state machinery of oppression. So it's not a walk in the park, military Keynesianism. Military Keynesianism, as we saw in the 1930s in Germany, as we see in the United States, because the United States, as you said, is a military Keynesian state. That's why they need to have a war every year or second year in order to clear the stocks and replenish their aggregate demand. So it is a catastrophe for the Russian people, but it's not a catastrophe for Putin. Military Keynesianism works very well for Putin and for his cronies. And this is what the idiots in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris don't understand. That if they do truly think that Putin is a clear and present danger to Europe, what they are doing by prolonging this war without a plan, without even paying for it, without even thinking of, what a peace deal might be like, they're creating the monster that they have imagined Putin to be.
Thank you, Yanis, and yeah, sorry to see you go, but all the best with whatever just came up there. Volodymyr, back to you. Let me just ask you, and I mean, we're talking about military Keynesianism, but I'd like to move the focus a bit more towards Ukraine itself, since we have the privilege of having you here, to understand a little more. I mean, we're hearing about, for example, this corruption probe with Zelensky, that his right-hand man who was negotiating for him has been taken off, and to avoid getting stuck in the probe, and all kinds of things happening. From my understanding, there's quite a lot of polarization in Ukrainian society. Can you speak to that? Because it's not something that often enters the discussion when we're talking about Ukraine, as crazy as it is. And I'm sure it's something that you can shed some light on.
Yeah, the question about what Western audience gets wrong, it's been quite often met with this question, as if I can say about the whole Western media. They're in fact diverse, and they've been quite silent on certain topics and strategically silent on them. But on the other topics, in particular about corruption, they have never ever, I think, had any kind of like how to call it. So it's always been, in fact, okay to criticize Ukraine for corruption, but not okay to criticize Ukraine for the human rights situation, for forced conscription, and especially brutal forms it took in the couple of recent years, for the ethno-nationalist policies, for the growing power and growing strength of the far-right units in the army, and so on and so forth. So though, when we start to criticize Ukraine on those topics, right, you're immediately becoming kind of like a Russian propagandist or reproducing Russian narratives and so on. But to say that Ukraine is corrupt is just something that I think has always been okay, and just speaks to specific interests on what we can criticize Ukraine and what we cannot criticize Ukraine, and what is more important for those who kind of dominate the Western discourse, and those things that are not important to them at all, and just a kind of like a distraction to their real interests. So speaking about corruption, and of course it gets to the question how efficiently the Western aid was used during the war. And even more fundamentally, the question of corruption is primarily the question of the conflict between the local elites, the local political business elites in Ukraine, who would benefit from the corruption, and the interest of the transnational capital, who would benefit from so-called transparency. And when the rules of the game in the country, like Ukraine, would be just transparent to them, and they would take advantage of their bigger capital and bigger capacity and bigger competitive advantages on the market. The question of corruption is primarily about that. So now we are getting to this conflict, which has been developing since at least the beginning of the year. But in fact, it actually points to the fundamental issue with the post-Soviet capitalism and post-Soviet elites and the way to discuss them. Because, well, did something like corruption was systemic for the kind of capitalism that emerged in the post-Soviet countries, where previously the Soviet state accumulated such a vast amount of capital, which then became kind of like predatory appropriated by different groups of elites. And we are now getting back that after all the Maidan revolutions in Ukraine, after building strong anti-corruption institutions funded by United States, by the European Union and other international organizations, we elect Zelensky as a new face in someone who was supposed to not having any connection to the old oligarchy corrupt elites. And Zelensky received over 70% of votes in the second round of the elections in 2019. But nevertheless, and especially during the war, when those issues like stealing from energy, stealing from military are just essential for the survival of the country, and well, the people are directly suffering from them, from the things that Zelensky's cronies were doing. We are getting to kind of like a typical norm of Ukrainian politics and economy. And well, that conflict between the big system of so-called anti-corruption institutions, which is something indeed like something like a state within the state, which was specifically intentionally designed so that the local interest would not take the control over them. And Zelensky was trying to precisely to take some control and to have the capacity to establish the loyal people. Probably Yermak was behind that scenario, but well, as Ukraine has been fundamentally dependent on Europe and not so much, in fact, dependent on the Ukrainian society, Zelensky withdraw with that idea when Europe said that no, you're not going to do this, and then the conflict escalated with the anti-corruption institutions digging more and designing I think, a quite smart campaign to reveal the evidence they collected against Mindic, against Zuckerman, two major figures in that corruption scheme, and recently leading to Yermak, to Zelensky's chief of staff. What it makes for Ukraine, that's now kind of like a big field of speculation. Some people believe that kind of like Trump is standing behind that, and he's kind of like creating conditions for Zelensky to accept any heavy deal that he would negotiate with Putin. Other people would say that's just probably no, because the anti-corruption civil society is in fact more against any compromise with Russia than even the neo-Nazi far right. And maybe it's something like another cunning plan from European Union to undermine any capacity for Zelensky as completely delegitimized and discredited person to sign any difficult concessions. Because otherwise, you just he goes into kind of like trash bin of history as a completely discredited and devastated leader who signed Ukraine's defeat. And other people would say this is just conspiracy theories, and it just happened that Dmitry Witkov, probably with Trump's involvement, they used this opportunity to impose on Zelensky their plan that they were preparing well before, but the investigation by the anti-corruption institutions were proceeding in parallel. But that's something that we would need to see how it's going to develop. We do not know who exactly would replace Yermak. There are many doubts that the influence of Yermak is going to just evaporate when he was dismissed from his former position. A lot of in Ukrainian politics is decided informally, and Yermak was capable to impose a big number of his loyal people in many institutions of the Ukrainian state, and it is likely, it is possible that he may retain the control over Ukrainian politics. And another question is whether the Ukrainian elites would be capable to unite against Zelensky and basically remove his powers, or just limit him to the constitutional powers that he has as a president, and which, according to the formal Ukrainian constitution, are not that expensive and pretty limited. Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential republic with a heavier weight on the parliament. But then, of course, it depends on the capacity to redesign the majority and to agree between the different groups of the Ukrainian elites, which have very divergent interests. But sometimes they were capable to unite against the current leader. The most interesting part is what's happening next when they achieve this goal, and whether they would be able to run the country better.
Thank you so much for shedding light on that. As someone noted in the chat, this is the sort of in-depth analysis that you don't often see in Western media. And on that note, let me ask you something else, which is a talking point I often hear about the lack of elections in Ukraine, that somehow Zelensky is a kind of a tyrant, that he refuses to have elections in order to cling on to power. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
That's a bit more complicated question than to call him a tyrant just because of that. And I would say that indeed starting elections during the wartime won't be stabilizing for Ukraine, and the threat of destabilization is pretty real. And elections are campaign, and it's just as you understand. And there would be a big question how to organize the elections when millions of Ukrainian citizens are outside of Ukraine. So that would probably require sort of a digital solution. And digital solutions have been typically notoriously vulnerable to different attempts of falsification of the elections results, and that might become another point of delegitimating the results of the elections and so on and so forth. So that's not just some easy thing to have an elections and then we'll solve all the problems with Zelensky's legitimacy. Apparently, it's also something that is discussed between Trump and Putin, the negotiators, the elections that might follow within, if I'm not mistaken, within 100 days, right after the signing of the peace deal. So they would Putin is actually pretty clear that he would not recognize any deal signed by Zelensky personally because he doesn't see him as a legitimate leader, and he believes that it might become kind of like a point to delegitimize and to dismiss the deal that might be eventually signed. And for that, he actually demands Ukraine to have another government. Well, and that's apparently become something accepted by Trump, and also probably something that a big part of Ukrainian elites would also aspire for, and now looking how they can improve their positions in the parliament and how they may push another president to the highest post in the country. And then it would be also about the question whether the old parliament is going to sign the very painful compromises, or it's going to be someone like, for example, Zaluzhny, the former chief of command of Ukraine, who was kind of dismissed into ambassador of London in the United Kingdom in London, but according to multiple surveys, he has the best chances to win the presidential elections. Although he's, again, another person who is not a politician and who would eventually need someone like Yermak to run the country. And another question of the political coalition who would back up Zaluzhny and so on. But at the same time, this is a person who might have a symbolic capital, sort of respect to say to the country that, well, we cannot fight anymore, and this is the best deal that we can get in this situation, and to save the lives and to save the remaining infrastructure in Ukraine. That also might be a way one of the possible scenarios that we might see.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And as we're coming to the top of the hour, there's one last thing I want to ask you, which kind of brings in basically everything we've been discussing at the beginning of this call, the peace deal, the war, etc., because all wars eventually end. And I'd like to understand your view on, after a ceasefire, what do you think is the biggest internal threat to stability in Ukraine? Is it the corruption that we've been talking about, the threat of economic collapse, a nationalist backlash, or some other kind of political fragmentation, or something else? What, in your view, is the biggest threat after a ceasefire?
Well, what I think the biggest threat is that it's not just Ukraine which is in disaster and suffered so much, but it's that Ukraine is something like a looking glass into the global crisis. We see the escalating, intensified fragmentation on the global scale, which is potential for the new wars in other places. This rift within the Western elites, the destabilizing tendencies within the EU itself, which may actually provide that opportunity for Putin to exploit the situation, precisely because the Western centrist elites are running the countries in this way and escalating the crisis. So, well, Ukraine may become something like, basically the fate of Ukraine fundamentally depends on the capacity of the European Union to solve its own crisis, which it does not look like so probable right now. And so we are in the very turbulent times. And Ukraine has been an important cause to introduce even more turbulence in the global politics. But I'm just afraid that even the war in Ukraine might, in a few years, look like something like what we recall about, well, Brexit or Trump elections in 2016 or COVID, which were totally unexpected and something like beyond imagination of many, many observers and regular citizens. But then every year we're getting into even bigger catastrophe. That's something that we see that the next year can bring something again, something unimaginable. The future is scary and it is also unknown. We cannot even imagine what is coming next. And that's something to think about, because on the agenda are something like a nuclear war, the escalation of the climate crisis, and this threat presents, well, existential threat to the whole humanity. And unfortunately, we are at the moment when we need to think about this and to say about this and to be very serious about this.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Exactly, and to collaborate rather than bulking up our arms and threatening each other.
And yeah, absolutely, and to fight global political solutions for the problems that require global coordination, rather than more fragmentation, more wars, and more conflicts.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for your time and your insight and very valuable analysis. A couple of last comments from the chat. Pipic9 says that Europe is already rearming and they'll redirect even more funds towards it. Many countries also have enough leeway to increase the debt if needed, and the Commission is allowing going above a 3% deficit. Mark Bulmer says that people in North America don't know very much about European politics, but they pay the taxes for these schemes to enrich the arms industry. Disposable notes that there's no need to take Putin's word for NATO expansion as the reason, but that's a red herring. Look up Stoltenberg refusing to sign the treaty, forever excluding Ukraine from NATO membership. And Yanis75 picks up on what you've just said there, Volodymyr. He says, modern war generates a lot of death and more wars down the road. Humanity should be focusing on the dangers of climate change with every effort. We're destroying the future with this 19th century bullshit. Well said. So, thank you again, Volodymyr. And if you are interested, guys out there, to get hold of Volodymyr's book, the title is, I have to get it in front of me because I forget it. Where is it? There it is. Ukraine, From Maidan to War. It's on Verso Books, and there'll be a link in the chat. In the description. I'm now losing the power of speech. It's been a very long and intense hour, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Volodymyr. Sorry that Yanis, to you guys out there, that Yanis had to leave early, and we will see you at the same time, same place, 2 weeks from now. Take care.